Welcome, astrologers and seekers and students. My name is Elena Lumen, and I would like in this short video to talk to you about something that we commonly use in our astrological practice, and we even learn this early on in our studies, and that is retrogradation of the planets. This short video serves as an introduction to a longer class that I will be teaching in July for Synchronicity University. I will be teaching it as a part of July speaker series. And so without further ado, let's talk about what is Arabic astrology and why insights provided by that period of time is useful in our today's practice, is both useful in Horary and natal astrology and other branches as well. So my plan of this talk is this. We'll talk about what it means, what retrogradation means in a traditional view, and specifically what Arabic astrologers said about it. And then we will see, I'll give you a short example since I have not a lot of time, but I'll give you a short example and taste how is it applied in Horary astrology, and then how is it applied in natal astrology. And we'll briefly talk about the upcoming class at the end. So we all learn about retrogradation pretty early on in our careers, in our professional studies or personal studies. And retrogradation, literally translated from Latin, is moving backwards. Right? Retrogradus means moving backwards, where we can see it on those diagrams. When one planet is moving slower, right, and another one is moving faster, then it creates this effect of the delayed train, right? Where it appears that the slower moving planet goes backward in space. So we call it retrogradation. And it is an apparent movement of the planet backwards. And if we look at the map, of, this is the Venus retrogradation cycle in one of the years, you will see that the path of Venus does not go straightforward, right? But it goes in this kind of zigzag manner. This is very important because as above, so below. As planets move physically in the sky, it has correlation to the affairs on Earth. So just notice that's interesting and very beautiful zigzag, right? It's going in this kind of manner, almost like a half figure eight, which is a retrograde motion of the planetary planet Venus. So what does traditional astrology say about retrograde? What Arabic astrologers say about retrogradation? It is considered difficulty, a challenge to planetary expression. And if you don't like, if you're afraid of the difficulty or debility, those classical terms, you can think of it this way. It is somehow a deviation from the standard course of the planet, right? So the planet doesn't really behave in a standard way. And the classical view is considered a debility or weakness of a planet. So in classical astrology, there are two types of weaknesses. It may be essential weakness or accidental. And retrograde motion is considered an accidental debility, right? So it prevents rapid and complete implementation of the planetary principle or delays it. So when we apply this principle to Horary or natal astrology in Horary, it is much more specific. I'll show you an example later today. And in natal astrology, it's more functional and global, almost archetypal, I would say. Sometimes it's more concrete, but the principle remains the same. So accidental debility is when planets' action or planet's nature cannot express in the most direct, straightforward way, right? So it is considered a weakening or maybe impediment in the planetary movement. And just to give you a sense about how classical astrology sees those accidental debilities, for example, well-known English astrologer William Lilly, he was given this kind of scoring. So for example, if planet goes direct, right, like right now, I think majority of planets are direct, right? Let's say Mercury is direct, Mars is direct, it gets +4 points in strength, right? Those points, they measure strength of the planet. And a planet at fast in movement, it gets additional +2 points. However, if planet goes slower, because it goes slow before it turns retrograde, slows down in its course, the William Lilly gives it -2 points. And if it goes retrograde, or when it goes retrograde, it gets -5 points. So the point scoring just gives us a sense that of planetary strength or ease of the expression of the planetary force or power. And just for you to notice that the difference between +4 and -5 is 9 units, right? So that's the strength, the measurement of the strength. And if we look at the Arabic view of the retrogradation, a very prolific astrologer, Sahl I Bishr, he said the following. He wrote the following: retrograde indicates delays and repetitions. You can think about it as a non-standard way of expressing planetary principle. And he said, a retrograde planet indicates disobedience, collapse, repetition, and disagreement. Okay, so that's the essential view of traditional astrologies on the planetary principles. Do you need to be scared about it? Of course not. We all live through Mercury retrograde, Mars retrograde, Venus retrograde, right? Outer planets retrogrades, common, right? It happens every few months or so. For some planets, it happens cyclically, right, with all planets. But what we can gain from it in natal and horary astrology, two things: deeper insight and more accurate predictions, in our analysis of the charts. Sahl also says about stationing planets, right? So we know that before the planet goes retrograde, it slows down, and then enters a period where it's called stationary for a couple of days. Then it goes retrograde, and then after a while, it enters second stationary period, and then comes out of the retrogradation, right? So the cycle is always like this because of the movement of the planets. So what Sahl says about stationary planets, he says, if a planet moves slowly, it slows down the time of the fulfillment of its promise. It delays time or the realization of a promise, both good and bad. Key factor here, good and bad, right? So sometimes we might be afraid of something in horary astrology, for example, right? Or maybe mundane astrology, but we see the planet is retrograde or slowing down, or stationary, and it might indicate that the fear will not bring anything serious, right? That it vanishes. But it might be good and bad depending on the context of the situation. So sometimes it can be very positive. For example, if you're looking for an item or an animal is missing, and you're making horary astrology, using horary astrology to find an item, a planet retrograding and indicating the item that is being sought might suggest a return to the owner. So retrogradation has many meanings, from literal to much more global and symbolic. So today I will focus more on the more global meaning in natal astrology and natal charts, but it can give us precise, very exciting, interesting details in our interpretation. So let's look at our first example, because I think it's quite exciting. And it's something personal that happened to me. I worked as a psychotherapist, as many of my students and followers know, worked first as a psychotherapist for a long time, over a decade. And I had a client with whom I had very close bond, very close relationship. We worked beautifully together. And anyway, somewhere maybe 7 or 8 months into our work together, he never missed a session, always is on time, always punctual. He didn't show up for the session. And after the same day and the next day, I texted him, called him a couple of times, right? I tried different ways of contacting him. He did not reply. So he ghosted me, right? In modern terminology. But I didn't really know what to think of it. He was very punctual and we had good relationships. So I started to feel worried. A few days later, when no messages came from him, I started to get worried. And I asked this question, is he okay? I started to wonder if he's okay. And is he coming back? So I won't go too much deeply in, here in is he okay? Well, maybe I should say a couple of words, right? Because if he's not okay, doesn't make sense to proceed with interpretation. But in the horary, I am shown by the ascendant, right? I am the person who asked the question. So the ascendant is in Cancer. It is ruled by the moon, so moon shows me. You may notice the moon is in Virgo, right? So I'm nervous, I'm worried about him, I care. We also have Jupiter here on the ascendant, co-representing me. So I'm a therapist to him, right? I'm a healer, so that's very nice that Jupiter in Cancer is here. And my client would be the seventh house, right? So Saturn rules him, Capricorn is here, and Saturn rules him. And we see that Saturn is in the fifth house retrograding. So the first question is to everyone, in my students, when we do this chart, is he okay? So yes, he was okay. And how do I know this? I know this by different considerations, but one of them is that Saturn, ruler of my client, is in the fifth house. For him, it's for him it's the 11th. But if he's in the fifth house in the natal chart, so fifth house is not associated with disease, accidents, death, or anything like this. It suggests more, recreation, fun, joy, and so on. But because it is Saturn in Scorpio and it's retrograding, it suggests something difficult is going on for him. He's not having a lot of fun. He's not having a lot of enjoyment in his life. And we can go forward, which I'm not going to do right now, analyzing what it is that caused the problems. You can look at the moon, right? You can look at the aspects of the moon. It would tell us what was going on. I can say that, for example, we can see that in the chart, there's a lot of tension here between Mercury, Uranus, the Sun, South Node, and Mars. So, and this falls in the fourth and the 10th houses. So that suggested tension at work and family, and you could really look deeper into it. But the point is, planet in the fifth house, moon was in decent shape in this chart, not afflicted, suggested he wasn't sick or nothing bad happened to him, which was good. And then we're coming to the second question: will he come back? So in order to answer this in Horary astrology, we look at, is there a connection? Is there an applying aspect between the planets which show me and him? So I'm the moon and he's Saturn, right? And we see that those planets are separating because the moon, though it is sextiling Saturn, it's 22 degrees Virgo, right? Sextile Saturn at 21 Scorpio, but it already bypasses the sextile, it separates. So that doesn't give us any hope of reconciliation. However, we can also see that the Jupiter is moving towards Saturn. Saturn is slower than Jupiter, right? So Jupiter co-represents me, is moving towards Saturn, and Saturn representing him, retrograding, going backwards towards me, right? So they are mutually applying, we say, right? Jupiter goes to Saturn, Saturn backwards goes to Jupiter. So from there, we can say, yes, he will return back, and retrogradation is especially welcome in that context. I want him to come back. I want to know what's going on, right? And it shows that he will also have this backward movement. No, we didn't separate. We didn't part our ways. Nothing horrible happened to him other than, intensity and stress in his life. And he will come back to me. So as you can imagine, when Jupiter and Saturn formed an exact trine, which was somewhere in May, right? I asked the question in April of this 2014. And roughly, I think it was May 4th or May 5th, roughly a month later, Jupiter, or maybe May 20th, Jupiter trined Saturn. And at the very exact day, he called me and asked to come back. So, and he explained later when we met, he said that he was under great stress, and I guess he got overwhelmed, right? He couldn't deal with everything, and he couldn't bring himself up to communicate with me. I guess he had an anxiety and just couldn't communicate. So we agreed with him that next time he would let me know if something like this is going on. We always can take a break. So now in the second half of the video, let's talk about the natal planets. The Horary charts, they require more specific analysis, but in nativity, we can take each planetary principle and see how it can be slowed down, how it can be delayed or influenced if the planet is retrograde. So some general topics to keep in mind when you think about natal charts of your clients, your friends, your own. if planet is retrograding in a natal chart, it suggests that we return to the topic of the planetary energy again and again. It's kind of like working in circles, fixating on a certain topic, right? You will see in the example, sometimes it's a relationship that pattern that repeats and repeats and repeats, right? Venus retrograde, or sometimes it may be a learning that requires repetition again and again and again, or slower process of learning, like such as with Mercury retrograde in a natal chart, or maybe it's Mars retrograde, so person has to work extra hard, right, overcome stresses and so on. But the idea is that we return to this planetary principle again and again. Some kind of circumstances represented by that planet, they repeat in our lives. So that's one theme to keep in mind. Second theme is there will be some delays in implementation of the planetary principle, right? So direct planet is direct, right? As the word suggests, it goes straight for the purpose, right? For the goal, straight to express its nature. But the retrograde planet will go in this kind of zigzag way, right? It's going to delay expression and implementation of its principle, whatever that will be in the natal chart. Modern astrologers say that if we have retrograde planets, that might suggest there are some lessons, some karmic lessons from the past that we keep repeating, right? And some say that the more retrograde planets you have in your natal chart, the more of those karmic lessons you have, right? So like we repeat, we learn until we master some lesson. And the final fourth theme to keep in mind before we look at the particular examples is that the retrograde planet is disobedient, quote unquote, disobedient, meaning it doesn't follow a direct course. It indicates difficulties in implementation. It might suggest loss of time in its principle or achievement of the principle of the planet, and it goes in a complex, roundabout ways. So that's a little more of a challenging part of it, right? But there is, of course, a positive, which we will talk about, is deepening or slowing down, right? Or going deeper into something, maybe going in an unusual way, which might be a beneficial force. But from the point of view of earthy desires, like we often want positive things and we want them without obstruction, then it's going to be delayed or somehow not going to go in a more straightforward way. So let's look at the examples. Mercury, right? This planet is commonly, because it frequently goes retrograde due to its close position to the sun. So Mercury, if retrograding, indicates difficulties with learning, communication, non-standard form of learning, or understanding the world or communicating in a somewhat unusual way. So, or different way or unique way, right? So on the positive, on the negative, again, it might take longer to learn something. It might delay communication and speech, but on the positive, it may suggest creative, unique, non-orthodox way of approaching things, right? So it all depends on the context of the situation. So here is an example of a nativity. It's a teenager, right? A young boy, and he has a few retrograde planets, but I'm gonna just zoom on Mercury here. So Mercury in his chart is in Cancer. It's retrograding. It's pretty close to his sun, right? Which is even more important because he's a Gemini, right? So Mercury is ruler of Gemini. But if we just zoom on Mercury as a planet of studies, language, absorption, think to yourself, what difficulty might this person have? And I think many of you would think, listening to this video, that it might be difficulty with studies or communication or language. In case of this boy, it was also delay in speech, right? Because his Mercury not only retrograde, but in Cancer. Cancer is a mute sign, mute in traditional view, right? So it doesn't incline to being very verbal, right? So this boy didn't speak until he was 3 years of age, and it took him longer to master the language. And when there's a language delay, then there's a delay in comprehension and other learning. So this is a very creative individual, but he does have learning disability. It's not extremely severe, but like I said, a speech delay, dyslexia, and he has ADHD, right? But all part of the complex together. But it's learning disabilities, dyslexia. Let's look at the Venus retrograde example. So if Venus is retrograde in the chart, it suggests delays in a relationship, difficulty building or sustaining the relationship, depending on the Venus's sign, or avoidance of relationship, right? So this case, the person is very much interested in the relationship because she is a Libra, right? The ruler of she's Gemini rising, Mercury and Sun are in Libra, very much oriented towards people, very much interested in relationship. It is in the fifth house, but Venus, planet of love and dispositor ruler of her Libra planets, is in Scorpio, is in retrogradation. I mean, it's with the node, it's in opposition with the moon. There's a complex pattern here that if we, and it's of course with Jupiter and Pluto, right? But if we just zoom on the Venus itself, she's very much interested in relationship, but for one reason or the other, they get destroyed, usually by her, right? Sometimes by other people. And she always runs trying to sustain the relationship, but cannot sustain it as a young woman, right? But hopefully, if she keeps working on this, maybe with therapy, I know she works with therapy, she is also quite into astrology and metaphysics and arts, right? So there are healing ways, there are ways to work with it, of course, same as in the previous example, but as a pattern, it's not easy for her, right? And it makes her suffer because she is interested in building a relationship. Mars retrograde. I don't have an example chart, but someone volunteered in my student group and they talked about their close person in their family, their brother, and he has very intense Mars in the 10th house retrograde. It is in opposition with his sun in the 4th house. I want to say his Mars is in Capricorn, but I can't remember right now. But anyway, Mars is retrograde in the 10th house. And he reports a lot of stress and pressure at work all the time, works very, very hard. He is very professionally successful, but with excessive obligation, and always he's like pushing and striving. Always more effort has to be put in than some other persons would have to do. So it's stressful for him. Yes, he's successful with Mars in the 10th house, even though retrograde Mars, but it's with a lot of effort on his end. And, one other manifestation of Mars retrograde might be difficulty of standing up for oneself, or on the contrary, person may be excessively reactive, right? So good Mars or direct Mars might be more controlled, right? But retrogradation suggests person either withholds or they have to push themselves to stand up for themselves. Jupiter in retrograde might indicate delays in realization of authority and social status. It's important for a strongly Jupiterian person to be recognized, to be respected. It could mean delays in finding one's own path, meaning, and faith, right? Sometimes. Delays could be linked to the house where the Jupiter is positioned. For example, in this example chart, a person has a few retrograde planets, but Jupiter retrograde. She has her meaning and her path, spiritual path carved out for her early on. She found and she never deviated, but professionally, she couldn't find a meaningful career, right? So Jupiter and Neptune connection here, both retrograde. So she couldn't find her something that truly feels meaningful to her. She had few professions in her life. That's also because Sagittarius mutable sign is here. And eventually she became an astrologer. That's most fulfilling of all, right? She had three professions in her life. So finds herself or finds her professional destiny with delay. And finally, Saturn retrograde, it might suggest delays or difficulties in implementing plans, especially for the career. So career might be either postponed, a person has to work harder to establish themselves. Often excessive sense of responsibility, guilt, or self-doubt. So one of my students said that she has Saturn in retrograde in Cancer on her ascendant, and according to her own report, she has a real sense of over-obligation to her family, always their priority. In her case, Saturn also squares her Mars and Mercury in the 4th house. And here is another example, someone close to me, a friend of mine, who has Saturn retrograde in her 7th house. So she also has excessive sense of duty, responsibility. She puts others first, and it took her time to come to her own realization, right? Her own fulfillment as a teacher and as a psychic, as a medium. So she has very nice Jupiter-Mercury connection, right? But Saturn in opposition, always duties, responsibilities, obligations, they are priority to her. She always puts other people first, excessive sense of obligations. And oftentimes she used to feel guilt or self-doubt, but she worked on it and she's working on it to let it go. So this was my brief introduction to the retrogradation and how it can be used in horary and natal astrology from the traditional point of view and from the point of view of Arabic astrologers. More to come in the upcoming class in July, Secrets of Arabic Astrologers for Natal and Horary Charts. You can look more on Synchronicity University website, or if you want to learn more about my work, you can find me on Facebook or Instagram, Elena Lumen, or you can go to my website, illuminatingastrology.com. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in July.